It appears that Helen of Troy in Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is going to be played by Lupita Nyong'o, and a lot of people are mad about it. I mean, what do you expect? It's the internet.
We're told that we shouldn't object to Helen of Troy being portrayed as a black woman, and yet if a major Hollywood studio made a film set in Africa and cast a white woman as the most beautiful woman in Africa, those same people would literally riot in the streets. If, say, Sydney Sweeney was cast in the role, they would be driven to murderous violence. We all know this is the case.
Now, this, of course, is not the first time that a black actress has played Helen of Troy. You see, Eartha Kitt played Helen back in 1950. Yeah, over 70 years ago, in Orson Welles' stage production of Time Runs, an adaptation of the Dr. Faustus storyline. This play helped launch Kitt's career, and from there she went on to play Catwoman, being the first black woman to play Catwoman, long before she turned Cusco into a llama.
A cat is a cat. She has no race, creed, or color, the way I feel about myself as an entertainer. I have no race, creed, or color. I belong to everyone.
But yeah, no one seems to remember that, do they?
I'm very supportive of Chris's intention with it and with the version of the story that he is telling. Our cast is representative of the world. I'm not spending my time thinking of the defense. The criticism will exist whether I engage with it or not.
In response to Nolan's Odyssey casting, a lot of commentators have said, well, if you're fine with a black Helen of Troy, what about a white Black Panther, a white T'Challa?
So, this is what I was saying earlier, is that I don't know if this is true, but apparently there might be a white Black Panther. I don't know if this is happening or not. Only in the comics there is. Dude, if they actually do the meme, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. Ryan Gosling will be the new MCU? I guess so.
This is actually old. This isn't new. I think this picture got posted around the time that the movie came out. So it's been around for a while.
This is a common response to a lot of race bending in media, and it often does get a response of someone going, oh, well, that's totally different. But people don't really explain why it's totally different, even though it obviously is. It seems inevitable that whenever there is a change in a character's race, there is backlash, especially if it's a formerly white character being recast.
From the team that brought you Why is Snow White Latina? Why are there black people in the Rings of Power? And Star Wars has gone woke, comes the latest online onslaught against an anticipated Hollywood project that committed the unfathomable sin of having a diverse cast.
Black Ariel, mixed race Snow White. Immediately memes go up saying, what if we made the Martin Luther King movie with Ryan Gosling as MLK?
Yo, man, who keep coming up with these things?
Thus, we see a battle between whitewashing and blackwashing, as it's been dubbed in some circles. It even gets extreme enough where fan artists who just draw, say, Kiki from Kiki's Delivery Service as a black girl, they get doxxed and threatened and ridiculous.
And we have another art-fixing controversy, I guess. In
debacle.
This debacle. We're going to talk about some Dan to Dan fan art that has been color corrected by a young artist, and this artist got ratioed actually by a Japanese person who said, why do we have to make all of the Asian characters black? And,
yeah, they blackwashed Ocarune.
This is despite multiple mods being created for various video games to turn black characters white.
We've seen different depictions of Nessa. Even before the game came out, we saw NSFW art, Rule 34 art, fan art of Nessa, both in her natural state and in her fairer skin state. And recently, there's been a mod release for Pokemon Sword and Shield that has caused the community, the ignorant part of the community, to run wild.
Or they're a black cosplayer cosplaying as a character who's not black. Usually Japanese, interesting enough.
Cosplay is a community, and then there's black cosplayers. We've had tons of issues in real life and online where people will say, oh, you can't cosplay that character because your skin's too dark or it's not canon, when in reality it's racist and it's not okay to say stuff like that.
This has no material impact on anyone, but people make this a big deal online.
I want to talk about everyone's favorite topic, blackwashing. Most people like it when an actor or actress looks like the character they're playing. Even with how many problems there were in the Aragon movie, people still went ballistic at the very first scene when they realized the actress' hair was dyed the wrong color. In the Captain N TV show, people were not happy with Mega Man being green when he was supposed to be blue. So yeah, whenever an adaptation is made, people like it when the character looks how they're supposed to look.
Yet despite the outrage towards blackwashing, These same folks seem indifferent to whitewashing. I know, shocking, right? Especially Nolan's whitewashing. Not just in the Odyssey, but throughout his entire filmography. You see, the Odyssey's cast is almost entirely white, with few, if any, Greek or Mediterranean actors. Matt Damon, Tom Holland, Robert Pattinson, Anne Hathaway, none of them are Greek, yet those are the core roles. Even among conservatives who are upset with Lupita Nyong'o, the biggest, most popular replacement for her among conservative commentators is Sydney Sweeney.
At this point, this should have been Helen of Troy. That one is Helen of Congo. This should have been Helen of Troy.
Sydney Sweeney, by the way, is also not Greek. You have 90% of the cast is white, but a couple black people, that draws ire. This is, of course, aligned with a general indifference to whitewashing from mainstream media, perhaps because historically it's been pretty prevalent. You see, Nolan has often cast primarily white casts in roles that are either ambiguously not white or absolutely not white. In Batman Begins, for example, Liam Neeson plays Ra's al Ghul. Ra's al Ghul.
Father's name was pronounced Raish, not Raz. A common mistake.
Ra's uses the moniker Henry Ducard at first, who in the comics is the man who helped train Bruce Wayne in manhunting and all that. Ducard in the comics is a white guy, sure, but Ra's is more ambiguous in the comics. Various writers have changed Rash's identity and ethnicity. It is generally agreed now that he is of Middle Eastern and Asian descent, though that's very ambiguous beyond what that means. An early origin even implied he was born in North Africa. What he isn't, though, is white. Similarly, his daughter, Talia al Ghul, is also not Arabic or Asian in the films, but white. But does this change who they are on a fundamental level? Well, I don't really know. Nolan changes so many elements of both characters already, it's hard to say which ones are anchored to nationality and which ones are anchored to just the character writing. There's no Lazarus Pit. Ra's is much younger than his counterpart in the comics, Ra's. Talia is not the mother of Batman's son. There's a lot of elements here that are different, and thus it's hard to really say which ones are specifically affected by making both characters extremely white. But one case where it's not ambiguous, where they had to rewrite the entire character to justify them not being a person of color, is Bane. In The Dark Knight Rises, Bane is played by Tom Hardy, who gives a fairly, I don't know if beloved is the right word, iconic performance, memorable, maybe, easily memed on. However, unlike Tom Hardy, Bane is not of British descent. He's from a Caribbean island between Cuba and Jamaica. He's Latino. His father was a revolutionary who was slain in battle, and the father's sentence was carried out upon his son. So Bane, a nameless baby, was sent to Peña Duro before being born. He became the most dangerous prisoner there and a test subject of the experimental strength-enhancing drug Venom. He then faked his own death and escaped, becoming a crime lord in the process with his sights set on Batman. So right there, that is fundamentally different than the Dark Knight Rises origin. But the iconic mask, that's the problem. You see, that had to be rewritten. In Nolan's film, the mask distributes a drug that staves off chronic pain from injury sustained helping Talia Ghul escape prison. But in the comics, that's not the case. Venom is often not injected orally through the mouth, but usually intravenously. So then, what's the mask for? Well, it's very simple. It's a luchador mask. Which makes sense for a Latino man who grew up in a prison, who idolized power and being unbeatable. It's a sign of raw strength. But it's not British. It's not something Tom Hardy could wear and it makes sense. So Nolan had to fundamentally alter the character. And this component genuinely changed who Bane is. Essentially, Nolan whitewashed Bane. And Bane is far more important to a Batman story than Helen of Troy is to an Odyssey film. Because Helen of Troy is not really relevant in the story of the Odyssey. The Iliad, sure, but not the Odyssey. Yet people don't really complain with Bane, or Ra's al Ghul for that matter. Perhaps because there's a history of whitewashing in Hollywood. Well, maybe. When people think of blackwashing, one thing they probably think of first is Tropic Thunder. The movie is a biting critique of Hollywood cinema and Hollywood culture. While every actor in the film does parody or satire some component of Hollywood life, the most noteworthy is, of course, Robert Downey Jr. Downey plays a parody of the method actor, someone who transforms for every role they are in, even if it's not suited for them in more respects than one. In the film, he plays a black soldier, going as far as to surgically give himself blackface to play the role of a black man. What makes this movie so clever is, of course, they draw attention to how offensive this is, especially because there is a black man on the crew, and he keeps pointing out that Robert Downey Jr. stole a job that another black guy could have played because he's just so ego-driven he had to take the role for himself.
Hell yeah! Ha! Hell yeah! Ha! That's how we all talk. We all talk like this, huh? You're Australian! Be Australian!
He wasn't the right guy for the role, but he still took the job from a better actor, better suited for that performance, with life experience that could inform their behavior. Yet he's able to pantomime life experience in a way that reads as deeply superficial and deeply offensive. But what makes this role so funny in some ways is it draws from real life, because historically, white people have stolen a lot of roles from actors of different ethnicities by just covering themselves up with a lot of makeup. It is important to note, of course, that there are some occasions where this happened for artistic reasons, like, say, Cloud Atlas, where, to show the various characters reincarnating over the several centuries, they put the various actors in white, brown, and yellow face. But this was widely criticized at the time, so I don't know if this was the best creative decision, but at least there is some intentionality here. This is not the case with most instances. You see, blackface and yellowface have a long history in the film industry. One of the first major film franchises, for example, was Charlie Chan, a series centered on an Asian hero who was regularly played by a white actor. I wouldn't be surprised if you never heard of the Charlie Chan series or the number of films based on him, but just know there are over 50 films featuring the character in America alone. There's also a bunch in Latin America, but it's a whole other discussion for the day. Anyway, cut to 1931, we have Charlie Chan carries on, and Warner Oland plays the character. It's the most iconic early performance of the character, and Oland would play Charlie Chan in multiple films afterwards. But he wasn't the first Charlie Chan. George Kua, Sojin, and E.L. Park all played the character earlier, all Asian actors whose role was stolen for decades by white guys in Yellowface. They had the role and then lost it. Charlie Chan is, of course, a parallel in many ways to Fu Manchu, who similarly was also played by white guys in Yellowface. In fact, the exact same white guy. Both were highly commercial characters who were never given to actors of the same ethnicity, and in part also played on stereotypes that were harmful about said ethnicity. The character's race was fetishized and made a commodity for film. And this trend carries on throughout Hollywood. First with John Wayne as Genghis Khan the Conqueror, to Mickey Rooney as Mr. Yonioshi in Breakfast at Tiffany's. By the way, this wasn't acceptable at the time either. In the years after, Mickey Rooney and director Blake Edwards expressed disappointment and regret with how that creative decision impacted the film and its legacy. To give you an idea how uncommon the opposite of all this is, when you type in whiteface, you get a mountain, not film. So, take that as you will. We all generally agree that blackface and yellowface is bad, unless you're a fan of the movie Soul Brother, which is a whole other discussion. But it's distinctly different from whitewashing. You see, one fetishizes different ethnicities, the other eclipses them. Indeed, blackwashing is already different. When Michael Clarke Duncan played the Kingpin in Daredevil, he didn't try to act white, nor did Idris Elba play white when portraying Heimdall. They didn't put on white makeup on. No, whitewashing completely changes things. People will often argue that there's a Gingercide happening, where ginger characters are replaced by people of color. It's a common fear, especially with April O'Neil and Mary Jane Watson. This, of course, ignores how blonde actresses like Kirsten Dunst were cast as Mary Jane originally, but just wore a really bad-looking wig. That first wig in the first Spider-Man movie is a little artificial. They also forget how in the original TMNT movies, April was a brunette, not ginger. Hell, in the first movie, her hair is the same color and consistency as Splinter's hair. The brown hair. Also, that Thor, who is often depicted as ginger in mythology, has across all Marvel media for decades now been blonde. It got to the point where God of War Ragnarok tried to harken back to the old designs of Thor, with him looking more like the god of thunder as depicted in mythology. But this more accurate version of Thor was rejected by the same people arguing we had a Gingercide, even though it restored the ginger hair.
So we gotta address this thing which was trending yesterday on Twitter. People complain about how the new Thor looks in God of War Ragnarok. Apparently they don't want this fat Thor. They say, this guy is not intimidating at all. I was like, dude, if you saw like a 6-foot dude with a big belly like that and a big hammer, that's not intimidating. But the scrawny Abercrombie and Fitch model looking one, this is intimidating. I was like, really?
Strange that happens, isn't it? This outrage seems selective, almost contradictory to an extent. But even then, most people don't really care about blackwashing, do they? Nick Fury, Electro, Heimdall, Kingpin, Commissioner Gordon, and many others have been played by black actors. And no one gives a fuck. Tim Burton's Batman casts Billy D. Williams as Harvey Dent. The plan was at one point to have him become Two-Face, but when it came time for Batman Forever, the studio recast him as Tommy Lee Jones. This is a case of blackwashing being reversed, and I think most people agree. I think Billy D. Williams would have been a better Two-Face than whatever it was that Tommy Lee Jones was doing in that movie. Both Aquaman and Namor were both race-bent for their live-action depictions, and most people celebrated these reiterations. Perhaps because it is not as visible as, say, Heimdall. Namor especially was completely rewritten, with his new origin reflecting his new ethnicity, but also a way to distinguish him more from Aquaman, who had been introduced to audiences first. This helped distinguish Namor further, which actually makes him stand out a little more from the crowd. This is different from what happened with Bane, because unlike with Bane, who had elements taken away from his character to reduce him, Namor had more added. One change was reductive, the other was additive. The push to get Donald Glover to replace Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man prior to Andrew Garfield's casting in part inspired Brian Michael Bendis while he was writing Ultimate Spider-Man to create Miles Morales. Even movies like The Shawshank Redemption has race bending in there. Morgan Freeman's character, Red, is in the books Irish. Why didn't they call him Red? It's because his hair's red. He's a redhead in the book, which adds the Gingercide again, I suppose. It's been going on for longer than you think it sounds like. But no one lists Red, Morgan Freeman's character, along the other cases of Gingercide, do they? However, the origins of blackwashing are extremely different than you might expect. 1930s Ingagi is a pseudo-documentary about a group of explorers discovering a tribe of Africans who have a disturbing relationship with apes. The film is highly regarded as one of the most racist films of the era. You might assume 1940's Son of Ingagi is a sequel to Ingagi. Well, it's not. While the director Richard C. Kahn is a white man, it was written by Spencer Williams, basing the film off of his own short story. It is one of the first science fiction horror films to feature an all-black cast. In other words, they took a racist film and capitalized it to elevate black talent, black writers, black actors, black set designers, etc. Years later, during the 70s, we had blaxploitation. This genre really sprung out essentially to give black audiences something to watch where they could see themselves on screen. And this led to films like Blackula, which was essentially a blackwashed version of Dracula that elevated the material beyond what the white producers expected of it, creating an artful, sophisticated horror film featuring an African prince who was turned into a vampire after challenging Dracula's participation in the slave trade.
Curse you with my name. You shall be Blackula.
It also led to films like Dolomite being made, which, while a cult classic and not particularly well made, was an opportunity for an all-black cast and an all-black crew to create something wholly for black audiences, drawing from tropes that were popular at the time. Before all of that, of course, you had Night of the Living Dead, a film that focused on a group of survivors during a zombie apocalypse. The script was not written with race in mind, but Dwayne Jones just happened to be the best actor who came up to audition that day. Jones would later star in Ganja and Hess, a blaxploitation film that took the vampire myth in a distinctly African direction. In all these cases, the films are notable for allowing black actors, black crew, and black talent to work. These are movies that first and foremost gave people jobs that could earn a living. You want to know my favorite example of blackwashing being used to elevate a story?
Helen, I came for you. Be my victim.
Candyman. Clive Barker's original story is set in England, and it focuses on the underprivileged in England, the poor. When the story was adapted to film, however, to appeal to a larger audience, they switched locations. They went from the British country to America, specifically Chicago. And they focused on the poor community there. And Chicago has a very famous history with the poor community because the ghetto was divided from the rest of the city by the train tracks. You ever hear being born on the wrong side of the tracks? Well, it comes from Chicago. They focused on Cabrini Green specifically, a very infamous apartment complex that had a lot of underprivileged poor people, mainly black people. From there, the story transformed into its current form. I think it's telling too that Candyman 2 and the third one, which everyone forgets about, almost features entirely all white actors. And it's much less like in that first film or Nia DaCosta's later follow-up. It was a common trend to remake older movies with black leads. And these remakes are maybe better than the originals in some cases, or at least very well known and have a beloved audience. The Bishop's Wife, for example, is a classic Christmas story from the 1940s that was remade as The Preacher's Wife. But it's hard not to love both for different reasons, especially the new one for its cast and warmth. You got Denzel Washington in there, how can you not love that? The Wiz is an iconic remake of The Wizard of Oz. It primarily has black actors, including Michael Jackson. But I think one of the most interesting examples of these remakes comes from a made-for-TV film that's become kind of iconic over the last several decades. Disney's first live-action Cinderella. Oh, you didn't see this one? Well, you should. It's on Disney Plus right now. It's a classic. It's an adaptation of the same story, except it has Brandy as Cinderella and Whitney Houston as the fairy godmother. And it's far, far more diverse than The Little Mermaid or Snow White. Blows them out of the water. But no one really talks about this film outside of the kids who grew up with it, with the families who loved it. But you don't see it online in discourse that much, do you? Even though The Descendants pays tribute to this version of Cinderella by bringing Brandy back as Cinderella. Hell, even today, we still get remakes like this. The Burbs was recently remade with a black lead. No one cares or minds, it's a good remake. There was mild controversy when Louis, in Interview with the Vampire, was changed from a white plantation owner whose slaves try to kill him to a post-Civil War black gentleman. But that version also received controversy, then again, for embracing the book's pansexual themes, where gender is barely a factor for relationships with vampires, which pissed off the same group of people who were upset that they were deviating from the book. People really were mad at the story where two male vampires raising an unaging girl had exactly that happening. It's a little hypocritical, I think, to an extent. Do you want the book to be faithful, or do you want it to deviate? Pick a lane. It's only blockbusters people seem to have outrage for that sustains itself, or niche projects like Queen Cleopatra, the documentary. Now, I discussed the Queen Cleopatra documentary in length in a previous video in the past, but the reason why I don't like this documentary either is it does change history, and this comes to a key element. Changing real people. That's different. When you whitewash history or blackwash history, you're changing the events. Because Cleopatra came from the Ptolemy line, a line of Macedonian rulers appointed after the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great. And there's little chance that Cleopatra was black because Ptolemy's descendants didn't leave much room for outside genetics. Family trees should not loop back 2 generations or spiral upon itself. And though it's not impossible that no genetics outside of the family came in, it's unlikely Cleopatra got too many genes from outside her own family's gene pool. But by the way, she didn't look like Elizabeth Taylor either. See, that's also whitewashing, because, much like in the Odyssey, people love to cast Northern Europeans as Mediterraneans. They are very different looking, don't do that. It was a big deal when The Godfather cast a primarily Italian cast to play Italian characters. That was revolutionary, and the studio had no faith in it. And that was only 50 years ago. And yet, to this day, the idea of an all-Greek cast for the Odyssey inspires as much confidence in the current studio system as Coppola's vision did in the 70s film studio, which is bizarre, I think. But also, unlike Cleopatra, Helen of Troy isn't real. She's not a real person. She's a fictional character. It's like King Arthur. They represent real ideas, but are so far removed from any tangible history that they don't exist as real people. It's like the Warrens from the Conjuring films. But again, that being said, though, we take liberties all the time with real people. Like, look at the Conjuring films. The Warrens in those films are nothing like the real con artists. I mean, alleged demonologists or whatever. But the big thing appears to be comic books, cartoons, and fairy tale characters, especially female characters. Men, they get a little bit of a leeway. Women, not so much. A lot of people will point to Snow White and Ariel as particular examples of blackwashing. Let's start with Ariel.
Disney was very proud 3 years ago when they announced that Halle Bailey would be playing Ariel. They're happy to push inclusivity and diversity in their films. They were proud when they said that we're not going to cast Ariel as a white girl, we're going to cast her as a black woman. So when this tweet got around, people very much questioned what disgusting film is actually talking about. And obviously, the backlash has been real and it has been powerful when it comes to YouTube.
A lot of people point to the original fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen and argue that Ariel is white in that story, so therefore she should be white in all iterations. But to that I say, when was Ariel in the original story? You see, the story focused on a little mermaid. It didn't specify her name was Ariel. That might be a little bit of a cheat there, but I get what you're trying to say, but that changes already. Disney made their film so far removed from the original fairy tale that it's impossible to argue that the nameless mermaid in that story is really the same character as Ariel. Their motivations for becoming people are different. What happens to them afterwards is different. It's an entirely different story. Hell, no one complains about Ponyo, another adaptation of The Little Mermaid, completely changing the mermaid into something also wholly unlike the original version. Because no one cares all that much. Go from white to Japanese, there's no issue. Go from white to black, all of a sudden people lose their minds. Even though they're completely different characters who are nothing alike each other. Because this is Disney changing the character they produced. And you might say, well, it's disrespectful of Howard Ashman, the creator of Little Mermaid, and all that, but I would say, Howard Ashman pushed Disney to add Jamaican crabs in the movie. I don't think he cares about the ethnicity of the fictional character, as long as the story is there. He worked on stage. They recast people all the time as established roles. That's not too unusual for them. For example, there was a production of Othello that inverted the races of all the characters. In Othello, the character Othello is a Moor, who is a person of color, in a society that is primarily white. However, in one stage production, they inverted it. Othello was the only white character, and everyone else is black. On stage, they do this kind of stuff all the time, and nobody bats an eye. In fact, it's just kind of accepted. There are no Jamaican crabs in the Hans Christian Andersen story. Because ultimately, who cares? Does Ariel's race meaningfully change anything in the story? Like, mermaids are fantasy creatures. Their bodies should be imploding from water pressure that far down. They should be drowning without having a chance to come up for air so often. Their bodies should be built like manatees, not like fish people with skinny waists. These stories are not grounded in reality. They're totally fantasy. So who cares about the specifics? There is no such thing as a real mermaid or what a real mermaid looked like. Snow White, though, people argue, is different because Snow White's skin tone is meaningful. It's brought up. Skin as white as snow, right? But I would argue two things. The first one being Snow White's good nature is more important than her skin color. Get that right, you're good to go. But secondly, Snow White is bad for a very different reason people don't talk about. The story was not a step forward representation. Its cast is primarily white. It actually pushed representation back decades. Yeah, ask little actors how they feel about Disney's Snow White. They're going to tell you a whole mouthful. Snow White, rather than cast little people as the dwarves, inserted these CG Uncanny Valley monstrosities for them. This is of course due to Peter Dinklage's comments criticizing the practice of only hiring little people as dwarves. Now, his intention was to argue Hollywood should cast little people in any role. But Disney saw that and went, okay, we cast little people as dwarves before, but now we can't hire little people ever. Okay, good idea. So Peter Dinklage is not well liked among little actors because of that reason.
Fuck you, Peter Dinklage. Piece of shit.
That's real heat, too.
Fucking hate him. He costed so many people in my community jobs. with that Snow White bullshit.
The people who complain about blackwashing don't just stop when it's blackwashing. They complain when black people appear in media ever.
I definitely had fun playing a particularly challenging game of Spot the White Guy with this trailer, because damn man, this one shows enough to fulfill Disney's entire DEI quota for the next 2 fiscal years. For example, check out this collection of Jedi Padawans and see if you can identify the one demographic that's mysteriously left out.
Take Riri Williams, for example, another creation of Brian Michael Bendis, after the success of Miles Morales, who, by the way, also faced backlash when he first appeared. Riri is a young black girl who replaces Iron Man, specifically Tony Stark, after she builds her own suit with stolen technology at MIT. For about a year, Riri Williams was Iron Man after Tony Stark was put into a coma by Captain Marvel in Civil War Part 2. Riri's comic is not good. I covered it in an older video and went into more detail there, but the backlash was disproportionate to what the comic actually did. You see, characters replace heroes constantly. Hell, Riri wasn't even the first black person to replace Tony as Iron Man. Some would argue that Rhodey, War Machine, was better suited to take up the mantle because he had been there longer. That, of course, said, Rhodey had replaced Tony Stark as Iron Man in the past. Tony wasn't being blackwashed, though. This is an original character who briefly stood in Tony Stark's shoes. This is much like how back in the 80s, Monica Rambeau replaced Mar-Vell, who was Captain Marvel at the time after he died of cancer. Unlike Tony Stark, though, Mar-Vell has never come back, so when Rambeau replaces him, that's it, he's gone. And Mar-Vell also, like Tony Stark, had an established peer who had seniority over Monica Rambeau, who was, like War Machine, almost groomed to replace him. And that character was Ms. Marvel, Carol Danvers. By the time, nobody cared. That isn't until decades later when Carol, after decades of struggling following major setbacks in her character, takes the mantle of Captain Marvel. And then people got mad that Monica Rambeau wasn't Captain Marvel anymore, even though she hadn't been Captain Marvel for decades at this point, and there were multiple other Captain Marvels between Monica Rambeau and Carol Danvers. Seems a little hypocritical, right? Hell, people complained if dwarves or elves are black in the Rings of Power, even though dark elves have been a thing in fantasy for decades.
From the same global entertainment industry that gave us Black Cleopatra, Black Little Mermaid, Black Anne Boleyn, Latina Snow White, Black female dwarves, Black elves, Black female Viking Queen Jarl Haken, and Black Snape, we get Black Helen of Troy, who is originally from Sparta, and I would expect this from the rest of Hollywood, but not from Chris Nolan.
And one of the most popular D&D stories ever published features a dark elf who faces racism. It all seems kinda hypocritical, doesn't it? But that's blackwashing. The internet would argue it's a thing Hollywood does nonstop, and that if whitewashing happened, the left would harp on it nonstop. Well, what if I told you? Whitewashing still happens. In fact, it happens consistently, constantly, and people just ignore it. Want a popular example? Blade. When people get criticized for not liking black superheroes, they always go, well, I love Blade. I would rage if they ever cast a white Blade. If they whitewash Blade, I'd be upset.
No form of swapping to me is acceptable, whether it be freaking Batman or whether it be Blade. I don't want Blade to be cast as a white guy, because Blade is a black guy, has always been. But my haters never mention this. Notice it. I've said it on every single video I've ever made, all the way back to 10 years ago. I've been 12 years on this platform. Every time I've condemned blackwashing, which is what happens 99% of the times now anyways, but every time I did, I always said I also wouldn't swap the other way around. They never say it.
Well, guess what happened?
Who are you? What are you doing here? I'm Peter Parker.
In the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, Blade appears as a substantially lighter-skinned character. Look at Peter Parker and him right next to each other. He's almost the same skin tone as Peter Parker. Now, I can argue that both Blade is a vampire, so being unnaturally pale is a feature of vampires, but Blade is also part vampire in all other iterations, and he's still so dark-skinned in there. So what's going on? John Semper, the showrunner for the 90s cartoon, is a black man. This plays into a concept called colorism, or bigotry among people of color against darker-skinned members of the community. Darker-skinned actors will often play villains or supporting characters, while lighter-skinned actors will be the leads. Compare Will Smith to Grace Jones. See the difference? which one's the main headline star. But the original movie, Blade, doesn't whitewash Blade, right? Wesley Snipes is a very dark-skinned man. Well, no, they don't whitewash Blade, but there is whitewashing in Blade. Whistler, played by Chris Christopherson, is an iconic character from the original Blade trilogy. He also appeared in that 90s cartoon of Spider-Man as a similar role, so you may assume this character is in the comics, because no one read any Blade comics before the late 90s. Well, he is not. While Blade's writer David S. Goyer and Spider-Man showrunner John Semper both claim they made Whistler and the other guy took the character, the reality is that Whistler did not appear in the comics.
Blade's mentor in the comics is Jamal Afari, who is not white. Prior to the first Blade film, Jamal had only appeared in one comic, Marvel Preview, issue 3. While he would be brought back in flashbacks and as a vampire in later books, like a couple issues years later, like after Blade Trinity, Jamal had only appeared in one issue, while Whistler appeared in 2 before the year 2000. Despite being a major film in the superhero landscape, Blade is guilty for whitewashing. It removed an entire character and replaced him with a white guy. Despite featuring multiple black actors in the movie, that's still whitewashing. But I know what you're thinking, oh, it happened decades ago. It never happens now. But no. I will not, from this point onward, list a single example of a movie containing whitewashing prior to the year 2000. That's after the X-Men. Look at the runtime. There's a lot of whitewashing to talk about right now. I'm actually going to leave out several examples, but yeah, brace yourself. A Beautiful Mind whitewashed the main character's wife. Jennifer Connelly's character, she's from El Salvador in real life. And she's a real person, too, much like Cleopatra. 30 Days of Night. Josh Hartnett plays a sheriff. In the graphic novel, that sheriff is Inuit. Angelina Jolie's character in the film Wanted, Fox, that character, is not only black, but she was designed after Halle Berry, much like how Ultimate Nick Fury was designed after Samuel L. Jackson, with the intention probably being, hey, we're gonna make a movie, Halle Berry player, right? The Prince of Persia and Gods of Egypt do not have any Middle Eastern or Egyptian actors in the film. Star Trek Into Darkness takes Khan, an iconic Indian character played by the Mexican actor Ricardo Montalban, and had him played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who is the whitest white guy you could ever imagine. Now, why does this keep happening? Well, there's a very cynical reason why, and it shouldn't surprise you. When asked why he cast multiple white, non-Jewish, non-Middle Eastern, non-Egyptian actors for the film Exodus, Gods and Kings, the historical epic based on the story of Exodus, director Ridley Scott said,
I can't mount a film of this budget where I have to rely on tax rebates in Spain and say that my lead actor is Mohammed so-and-so from such and such. I'm just not going to get it financed, so the question doesn't even come up.
Which, yeah, that sums it up, doesn't it? Hollywood's not a social machine. It's a marketing machine that sells a product. And in order to conform that product to the mold that's acceptable, directors need to sell themselves to cynical marketing types. That's why people got upset with The Godfather when they cast an all-Italian cast. I really want to reiterate, that film really changed Hollywood for a while. Though apparently the effects are wearing down. The progress made in the 70s has not lasted to the modern day. That's why these black remakes were greenlit before, to sell movies primarily made for one audience to a different audience, a modern audience, a growing audience. It's also why so many remakes of Asian films cast an almost entirely white cast. Like The Ring, The Grudge, Oldboy, the Death Note remake, and many, many others. Black media in the 90s and 2000s, and I mean media aimed primarily for black audiences without white audiences in mind, were often far lower budget. That Brandy Cinderella movie, it's great, but it was made for television on a relatively low budget. That meant they could take more risks because the needed return on investment was lower. Some directors like Kenneth Branagh gained a reputation for colorblind casting. In his adaptation of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, for example, set in the Italian countryside, we are told that Denzel Washington and Keanu Reeves are half-brothers. Yeah, the Italian Denzel Washington and Keanu Reeves are half-brothers. This film is widely seen as one of the best adaptations of the play, especially over the Joss Whedon film, which had more white bread casting to be accurate to Shakespeare's intentions.
Then again, any Shakespeare production without an all-male cast already breaks from Shakespeare's original intentions. So, Romeo and Juliet with a guy and a woman? That's already breaking convention right there. Put a guy in a dress and make them kiss already. If your project required a larger budget, historically, you could not make a big movie, or even a made-for-TV movie with a slightly higher budget, with a fully diverse cast. You needed more white people. Movies like Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians were a big deal at the time, and honestly even now, for being big-budget films to feature a cast full of people of color that weren't historic stories about slavery. Because apparently Hollywood loves making slave movies, and then cast black people for nothing else, for a very long time. There were many films that are based on real stories, where real people were whitewashed, to make it mainstream and marketable. 21 is a movie based on a true story about students gambling. Every main character in the film is white, but every person they're based on was Asian American. They whitewashed an entire cast. Hachi, A Dog's Tale, takes the tragic story of Hachi and completely whitewashed it. In real life, Hachi was a dog from the 20s who returned to the daily train station his master returned to every day from work, even after his master died, in Japan. This was later adapted into a Japanese film in the 80s. But the 2009 film took this real-life tragedy and transplanted it to modern-day Rhode Island, and cast almost entirely everyone as an American, with the notable exception of the late Cary Hiroyuki Tagawa, Shang Tsung himself.
Your brother's soul is mine.
You could do worse, I guess, but still. The MCU has had a long history of criticism about whitewashing its heroes, specifically Scarlet Witch and Doctor Doom, both of whom are Romani in the original comics. The Nepali Ancient One is whitewashed in Doctor Strange, perhaps to avoid pissing off China, so they would distribute the film over there to make more money. Always very cynical marketing choices. And mind you, the actors they got are all good, but they're not appropriate to the character's casting. And speaking of that, Marvel's version of Fu Manchu, the Mandarin, was for several years played by white actors.
I am the Mandarin!
The reason being they were afraid of casting an Asian actor in a role based on fetishization of Asian tropes. But, as we saw with Shang-Chi, they could still cast the Asian character with an Asian actor, and it would turn out really good.
The Mandarin. He gave his figurehead the name of a chicken dish.
The Mandarin is fantastic in Shang-Chi because they took a risk with the character and made appropriate changes accordingly. Prior to that, they whitewashed him repeatedly. Although, that being said, one version of the Mandarin was an actor, so. While Speed Racer is a movie that has gotten its flowers over time, the characters are all Japanese in the original iteration of the anime. But because of how the names are localized, they played it safe and implied they were all just white people for the most part.
The family known as the Racer family in localization is known as the Mifune family in Japanese, and while the names are still puns, it's Japanese puns, not English puns.
The movie Aloha is especially egregious though. It's a film set in Hawaii where all the cast is white, with special focus being put on Emma Stone, who plays a part Hawaiian, part Chinese character. Yes, Emma Stone. Chinese. Now, Sony Pictures would defend Aloha upon release. Emma Stone later distanced herself from the film, admitting it was a mistake to take the role at all. Something similar happened to Ghost in the Shell, where Scarlett Johansson played the Japanese cyber cop Motoko Kusanagi from the manga and anime Ghost in the Shell. Though that film tried to justify the casting by having Johansson's character essentially body hop into a new flesh body. A similar thing also would happen later on in the show Altered Carbon, though that's more a white guy being put into a black person's body.
The core difference is, of course, in Altered Carbon, this body hopping element is built into the narrative. In Ghost in the Shell, while Motoko Kusanagi does change bodies depending on how damaged her shell becomes, it's not ethnicities, it's usually age or size or defensive capabilities, not going from Japanese to white. At least in the traditional anime and manga. The reason this was done in the film was to justify casting a big name for the main character. The same reason Ridley Scott used Joel Edgerton for the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses. And Scarlett Johansson did not seem particularly upset being cast like Emma Stone did and didn't really distance herself at all from it, so it's a little different, but you get the idea. I think two egregious cases of whitewashing are the Sci-Fi Channel / Hallmark's adaptation
of Earthsea, and M. Night Shyamalan's adaptation of The Last Airbender. Both rank among the worst fantasy adaptations ever made. Both were worlds that featured casts comprised almost entirely of people of color, and both are film adaptations that completely changed everything about the work. Earthsea is a novel series by Ursula K. Le Guin that started in the mid-60s and continued for decades afterwards. The series exists as a counterbalance to the mainstream fantasy at the time. Rather than feature a European-inspired continent, the series takes place on a tropical archipelago filled with brown and red-skinned societies, where white people are the nomadic savages to the north that worship evil gods and all that good stuff. The story's problems are often internal, where mistakes and misguided beliefs infect the world around them, causing pain, imbalance. The sci-fi adaptation, however, completely ruins this by mixing two of the books together into one story and creating a new evil villain to fight who is completely divorced from the conflicts of both books it's combining, which means it's mixing up 3 different plots and doing none of them justice. And it eclipses all the conflicts in the original books entirely. But also, for the sake of our video, it's relevant, everyone's white, except for one guy who's played by Danny Glover. Ursula K. Le Guin didn't like this all that much. In an op-ed for Slate titled A Whitewashed Earthsea, Le Guin writes,
Race, which had been a crucial element, had been cut out of my stories. In the miniseries, Danny Glover is the only man of color among the main characters, although there are a few others among the spear carriers, a far cry from the Earthsea I envisioned. When I looked over the script, I realized the producers had no understanding of what the books are about and no interest in finding out. All they intended was to use the name Earthsea and some of the scenes from the books in a generic McMagic movie with a meaningless plot based on sex and violence. Most of the characters in my fantasy and far future science fiction books are not white. They're mixed, they're rainbow. In my first big science fiction novel, The Left Hand of Darkness, the only person from Earth is a black man, and everybody else in the book is Inuit or Tibetan brown. In the 2 fantasy novels the miniseries is based on, everybody is brown or copper red or black, except the Kargish people in the east and their descendants in the archipelago, who are white with fair or dark hair. The central character Tanar, a Karg, is a white brunette. Ged, an archipelagan, is red-brown. His friend, Vetch, is black. In the miniseries, Tanar is played by Smallville's Kirsten Karuk, the only person in the miniseries who looks at all Asian. Ged and Vetch are white. It is so weird to see Le Guin mention Smallville. I know she only passed within the past decade or so, but it is just wild because I just don't really think of her as contemporaneous to that era of television. But I mean, it's true. But it's a weird thing.
Kristen Krug, by the way, who is biracial and half Chinese, would later go on to play Chun-Li in The Legend of Chun-Li, which, is that whitewashing? I mean, she's partially Chinese, but still.
The Last Airbender, however, is a little bit more well-known because of its larger mainstream acclaim. The world of Avatar is modeled entirely after multiple real-world cultures. The Fire Nation is Japan, the Air Nomads are Nepal, the Earth Kingdom is China, and the Water Tribes are Inuit and native populations to the north. These influences impact not only the characters' genetics and appearances, but also their culture, their martial arts, their architecture, and their language, even their naming conventions. Diversity is a very conscious choice, a part of the story that is built into it. M. Night Shyamalan's adaptation removes all of that. Now everyone's white except for the Fire Nation, who are now Indian, like Shyamalan, which is a choice to make the only villain culture your own culture, which completely ruins the original series' intended goals.
In a 2020 interview with Bustle, original series director, writer, and storyboard artist Giancarlo Volpe had this to say about the adaptation.
I thought the set design was great. I also think that CG Appa and Momo look great. If you squinted, it looked like the show. But where they sort of went wrong was that the characters and casting weren't really right. I thought that was unfortunate. I've said this multiple times, if there was ever any doubt that Avatar took place in some sort of mythical Asia or mythical China, it absolutely did. Don't let anyone tell you differently, and to cast it differently was an odd choice.
There are a few key differences between Earthsea, Avatar, and the Odyssey. The Odyssey, for example, has been adapted dozens of times, if not hundreds, over the last century. However, Earthsea and Avatar are the first adaptations of their work. Both received later adaptations, sure, that, while marginally better, are still negatively received by fans. But all three have casts that are completely recast from the ethnic background of the original. And in all three cases, the ethnicity of the characters is very important. Yet only two casting decisions seem to matter to people in the Odyssey: Helen of Troy and Achilles.
And that's why the rumor of Paige playing the ghost of Achilles, something that a lot of people thought was preposterous a few days ago, has now become believable. And the memes have been glorious.
It is currently rumored at this time of writing that Elliot Page will play Achilles, the mythic hero of legend. Let's ignore for a second that Achilles was successfully able to disguise himself as a woman to dodge the Trojan War for many years, and was convincing as a woman, which implies he's not like a big hunky big guy. This is one of the few times a trans actor has been cast for a character who was originally cis, because usually the opposite happens. A non-trans actor playing a trans person, usually badly, even if well-intentioned. Until really Orange is the New Black came out back in the 2010s and brought Laverne Cox into our living rooms, it was exceptionally rare for trans actors to appear in major films or TV at all, like in any capacity. And if they did show up, it was a spectacle. Now, there were stories about trans characters, but they were often not respectful. The first movie to show a trans character in it, 1953's Glenda, the Ed Wood movie that was inspired by the Christine Jorgensen transition story, a real case of a sex change operation.
Frankly, Glenda is a bizarre movie. It started as an adaptation of the Christine Jorgensen story, but very soon became Ed Wood's personal diatribe about his own gender presentation and concepts about gender. It's hard to say if Ed Wood was trans or a crossdresser or whatever, because I don't think he understood himself what he was. At the time, it was filmed when it was illegal to dress as a woman in public if you were a man. So the film is kind of radical for basically breaking the law in front of its audience just in order to make a cheap movie that became well known for being the movie where Bela Lugosi says random stuff to the camera.
Hold the string!
From there, trans rep was often vague or a one-off character in the background. Rocky Horror Picture Show, for example, has an uncertain relationship with trans identity. It's a very ambiguous film sometimes. The movie Aliens, for example, also had a very brief confirmation that in the prior film, Lambert, one of the crew from the first movie, is a trans woman. But this detail is extremely easy to miss because it's a computer screen in the background of a shot that has it there.
It should also be noted coincidentally that Lambert's death is also the most sexually violent of all the death of the crew in the first Alien, with it being implied that she's torn apart from her, you know.
The World According to Garp has John Lithgow playing a trans woman, an early example of positive rep at a time when that was very uncommon. And it's a good thing Lithgow never took any roles made by any transphobic creators who donates massive sums of money to anti-trans political causes that could soil the legacy of that role. Nope, not at all. But most trans characters in film were villains or gag characters in movies like Dressed to Kill, Sleepaway Camp, Ace Ventura, Naked Gun 3, or present in more dramatic films like The Crying Game or Orlando. Later productions like, say, Transamerica or Dallas Buyers Club would feature trans characters in critically acclaimed roles, but the characters were played by cis actors. In one case, it was played by Jared Leto.
I think the disturbing implication is very clear, though. Cast an actual sexual predator to play your trans character, you get an Oscar for your film and critical acclaim. Cast an actual trans actor to play your character, your film doesn't get funding, much like casting an actual Egyptian to play the Pharaoh Ramses.
To give you an idea how odd all of this is, imagine if in Glory, all the black soldiers were played by white actors. Basically, the plot of Tropic Thunder. Or hell, watch the version of Othello where Anthony Hopkins plays the black Othello and everyone just acts like he is black even though he just has bronzer on. Tropic Thunder is a true story if you base it off of these nonsensical things. Or that one episode of Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater, where Leonard Nimoy plays a Middle Eastern villain. That episode is directed by Tim Burton. I'm not even fucking kidding with you right now. But I'm not talking about those movies. I'm gonna go worse. I got one for you that's like a fucking field goal of an example. Let's talk about Stonewall, the Roland Emmerich film based on the historic Stonewall riots. Never heard of the time the guy made Independence Day in the 90s Godzilla film did a Stonewall movie? Well, God, I envy you because this film is absolute fucking garbage. While no one knows exactly who threw the first stone at Stonewall, Marsha P. Johnson was there. While for a while it was said she threw the first brick, she had said herself she didn't get there till after the riots started. But she was still a key figure in the movement before and after the riots. And while all accounts conflict on the specific details, it was after all a riot, it is generally accepted that she was a key figure in that story. And so the film decentralizes her, as well as all lesbian characters, all brown people, just really original white characters. That's what matters. Because you see, she's in the movie, Marsha P. Johnson. She's played by a man. She's the comic relief, basically. The movie decentralizes people of color, women, and trans people to focus on the gay white men, who were not real people at the riots, but original characters inserted into the narrative to push the real people out of the narrative. An example of this is Stormy LaVerry. She was one of the figures who was instrumental in starting the Stonewall riots. She was a butch lesbian who, when the cops pulled out of the bar, was screaming for someone to do something. She appears in the story, briefly, but she's decentralized. She's barely a presence there. Sylvia Rivera, who is a trans activist, is kinda sorta here. She's reinterpreted into a new character in the movie, an original character who doesn't act like Sylvia would have acted in real life and plays a different role in the story and is, again, decentralized from the actual riot itself, and is in fact opposing the riot despite in real life throwing a Molotov cocktail during the riots. So it just feels disrespectful to the real people to have all these OCs who are loosely based on real people, or not at all based on real people, taking the roles real people played in the actual event. And while some people are loosely inspired by real people, the appearance, background details, their personality, their actions are completely changed entirely. You only know that it's kind of sort of like a real person if you're really familiar with the history of Stonewall, which I can guarantee you very few people know every single person who's involved in Stonewall. You have to look it up. I had to look up these details. I didn't know off the top of my head. And they have an original character, a new white guy made for the movie who throws the first brick at the actual Stonewall riots. Meanwhile, Marsha P. Johnson does fight Hellboy, so I guess there's something there. To give you an idea how offensive this was to people who were actually at the riots, I'm going to read it. I'm going to have a quote from a PBS op-ed by Mark Siegel, who was, at the age of 18, a participant, or at least involved in the Stonewall riots and the early gay liberation movements. To quote him,
Stonewall is uninterested in any history that doesn't revolve around its white, male, stereotypically attractive protagonist. It almost entirely leaves out the women who participated in the riots and helped create the Gay Liberation Front, which included youth, trans people, lesbian separatists, and people from all other parts of the spectrum of our community. I'm not sure who Stonewall was made for. It wasn't made for young LGBT people seeking good LGBT history, nor for a community who wishes to see its history portrayed with dignity and respect, and without perpetuating stereotypes and old myths.
Do you know how the community responded to the Stonewall movie? They didn't watch it. The film was completely rejected by its audience and ditched by them. But Emmerich didn't really get why people hated his film. In an interview with The Guardian, after Stonewall grossed a pathetic $250,000 against a $14 million budget, Emmerich stated,
"My movie was exactly what they said it wasn't. It was politically correct. It had black transgender people in there. We just got killed by one voice on the internet who saw a trailer and said, 'This is whitewashing Stonewall.' Stonewall was a white event, let's be honest. But nobody wanted to hear that anymore."
Yeah, so Emmerich's response to the accusations of whitewashing was to continue whitewashing Stonewall. That sounds about right, Emmerich. I cannot emphasize enough how much worse Stonewall is than anything else we've talked about so far, because this was a major historic event, a landmark in American history, where they changed everything. They take everyone who was in the actual event and replace them with a new insert who's nothing like the original, for the sake of whitewashing history. Now mind you, this movie came out the same year that gay marriage was legalized in America, and people still didn't fucking watch it. That should tell you right there. That's way worse than Helen of Troy, a fictional character being black in one film. And by the way, whitewashing is still happening, even ignoring Nolan's Odyssey, which whitewashes the entire cast. You got Wuthering Heights and the Street Fighter movie. Dan Hibiki, a Japanese character, is played by Andrew Schultz. No one's happy about this, because no one fucking likes Andrew Schultz, on top of being whitewashing. In Wuthering Heights, however, Heathcliff is played by Jacob Elordi, despite Heathcliff being dark-skinned, possibly Romani, in the book. And that plays a major role in Heathcliff's story because Heathcliff faces racism. It's a major component as to why Heathcliff turns out the way he does. And they make him white in almost every film except for one. And one version even has Tom Hardy again. This guy keeps whitewashing movies. Even real people still get whitewashed. 2023, the film Tetris. Taron Egerton, he plays the guy who brought Tetris to the world, Hank Rogers. Rogers is part Indonesian. Egerton is not. Massive deal, it's biracial, but that's still significant, isn't it? Now, is every example equally terrible? Well, no, of course not. In fact, some examples here have been given the blessing by the real people they're based on or the original creators of the work. For example, the real-life people who 21 depicted don't care what actors played them. Or at least they didn't back when the film came out. They wanted actors to play them and show their story, and they were happy about that. And that's subjective. That's a case-by-case basis. But let's talk about the sweeping generalities of it. Does the race change anything? Well, sometimes it does. Film studios want to market the films to broader audiences, and the United States is not a primarily white country, so they have to market to everyone else. But the version of this country you see on screen does not reflect the version that really exists. According to the UCLA Hollywood Diversity Report, and this is a direct quote from the LA Times summary of said report, actors of color accounted for 25.2% of lead roles in the top theatrical films of 2024, which is down from 29.2% in 2023. People of color, at this time, account for 44.3% of the United States population. A massive chunk compared to what's on screen.
But here's the thing. When blackwashing was done, it was to give people jobs, to give entertainment for an audience that demanded entertainment. But now, what are we doing here? If people of color account for half of the country basically, why are so few of them actually in these movies? Why they represent such a small chunk of the population? Why are we not giving jobs to people who deserve it, but instead giving it to people who just might be easier to market to an audience? Crazy Rich Asians, Black Panther, they were noteworthy for just doing the things that the average movie does. A cast comprised entirely of one color of skin. Why are we denying jobs to such a massive population, especially for roles written for them? And don't pretend the film execs are somehow woke or progressive in some way, when we've all seen they're more than willing to throw that away if it means just a little bit of money. In fact, jobs are shrinking in Hollywood while executive pay is increasing. And specifically, certain demographics are hit harder than others because, as we're seeing, diversity is shrinking, meaning fewer people of color are getting jobs in the Hollywood system. What whitewashing proves is that constantly, roles written for diverse people are given to white actors. Helen of Troy is the only blackwashed role, as opposed to the rest of the Odyssey's whitewashing, and the whitewashing in both Street Fighter and Wuthering Heights. Oh, and the whitewashing in Doomsday, for example, where the main villain, a Romani, is played by a white guy. I think that's a bigger deal than Helen of Troy. She's a minor character in the Odyssey. Her story's done basically at this point. But Doom is the central figure in Doomsday. Does anyone think it's kind of bizarre, with all the hoopla being spread about Helen, that no one is criticizing Doom? At least not to the same extent. People are used to whitewashing, they're not used to this. But then I guess if you have 3/4 of the pie, when the other side asks for crumbs, you get mad.
Pull the string! Pull the string!